Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's New Year's Eve today. Last year for New Year's Eve, I repainted one of the old dragons from my middle school sketchbook, and I wanted to do something similar again this year. There's still a bunch more dragons in that old sketchbook, so Discord decided I should make one of them instead of making the same dragon again. So I made a poll and you guys voted for the sea serpent. So that's what I'm painting for today's video. I hope you guys enjoy. So I start off with my regular process, starting with a sketch and going from there, but I really don't like how this is going. I end up with this, which is fine and it's an improvement over the last one, but I thought it was really boring in terms of the perspective and the colors, and I had messed around with the lighting a bit and it just didn't really work out. So I started over. I made a couple of tiny sketches to get a better idea of the pose and then started painting. For the second version, my main goal was to actually have an interesting pose and perspective and composition, which was all the things that were kind of missing from the other one. So rather than making a regular sketch, I kind of made a very rough black and white painting, just using a big brush to block out the overall flow and just shape and composition and all that. I started out with the sea serpent himself, not really focusing much on the design, just making sure all the general components are in, and pushing and pulling things around until I kind of like how it looks. Then I add a fish which he's chasing. I also block in the background and add some atmospheric fade to the characters. And now I really push the perspective. I scale up the head and the fish and stuff quite a lot and go around with the liquify tools. I'm really trying to push the feeling that the characters are moving towards the viewer. At this point I realized that the scale is quite off. The dragon looks way too small for the concept and the idea I had. So I mess around for a while and eventually decide to replace a single big fish with a whole school of smaller fish to make the dragon look just a lot bigger in comparison. Since this is just a sketch, I just duplicate around the fish I already have rather than making a new one. Now that I'm happy with how the base looks, I finally go into my regular sketch. I turn down the opacity of the rough painting layer and then just go over it with a fairly refined sketch. I make separate layers for the dragon, the fish and the background, so that way it's a bit easier to manage later on. For the design of the dragon, I really wanted to keep the feel of the original, but kind of update it and make it more like something that I would have drawn more recently. So it's still a very long snake-like dragon with all the limbs kind of replaced with fins, but I changed the shape of the fins, especially the wing fins I guess, and stretched them out to go all across the body. I also replaced the kind of back spines with another long fin, similar to the one sailfish have. I also took a lot of inspiration from moray eels, especially in the beginning when it came to the face. For the fish I just wanted very generic, kind of panicked looking fish, which makes sense obviously because they are being chased by a giant sea dragon. I also sketch a bit of background, but that just stays fairly plain, boring seafloor. In the final painting you don't even really see that much, it's mostly blurred. And now it's about time for color. Before I start, I make 3 group layers for the dragon, the background and the fish, so I can have the sketch and the color and any other layers all separate based on what part they belong to. I start with the background, just adding a rough gradient following the contours that I had sketched out. Then I move on to the dragon itself. I add just a very basic blue color, and then I go back in later and add some more details and patterns. Then I go in for the fish, I block them in with a basic gray and then add some more darker grays below to give the swarm, or to give the school some depth. I add an additional layer to the dragon group for the atmospheric fade so that I can have that on a separate layer so it doesn't get in my way while adding shading and colors. I also switch around the colors of the dragon, giving the fins a bit more of a cooler blue and making the main body kind of cyan with some blue stripes. For the shading, I add a new layer, set it to multiply, and select the A in the corner so that the color doesn't go beyond the confines of the layer. And then I fill it in with a dark blue for the shadows and go in and erase out the places where I want light. I also add a second multiply layer and paint in some darker shadows for ambient occlusion in some places. I repeat the same process for the fish. I also add a second layer set to overlay to bring out the highlights a bit more. The original drawing had the dragon zapping a fish with its tongue. I couldn't really think of a way to make that work without having it look weird, so instead I gave him a kind of glowy electric stuff in his mouth to make it look like he's about to zap the fish. I stacked several layers on top of each other with different effects and slightly different colors until I was kind of happy with the glowy feel of the sparks in his mouth. I merge down the background layers and paint the sketch in, and then I go back into the fish and the dragon and add a bit more detail. At this point I just kind of start merging all my groups down and just going in with opacity brush. For this painting I actually used mostly just basic hard round brush, and just go around using a color picker and the brush to just blend stuff out, change the shape. I messed around with the face a lot until I kind of reached something that I was happy with. I messed around with shapes of the fins and the patterns and the glowy effects, and I also used some additional layers set to like overlay and screen to add some more interesting details in the eyes to make them look glowy, or to the scales to make them look a bit more iridescent, and stuff like that. This stage is really just a lot of messing around and refining. I have already set up the basics beforehand, so it's just a matter of cleaning up and continuing until I'm happy with it. I could technically just extend this stage on further and further and make the painting more and more detailed and more clean, but eventually I stopped and finished it up. I really enjoyed doing this little kind of challenge. It's really fun to go looking back through my really old art to kind of see like how my interests have changed and stuff like that. I've really always been a fan of dragons. You'll notice if you look at my art from like this year, dragons take up a huge part of the stuff I've drawn, and that's kind of always been the case. Back when I made these sketches that I showed you in the beginning, that was when I was about 11, when I was in middle school, and I wanted to make this cool book of dragons, and like I had the stats for all the dragons written up on one page, and I really kind of want to redo that at some point, like remake some of the old dragons, which is something I've done now for 2 of them, but also make a bunch of cool new dragons. And I have some ideas, but I've really never gotten around to really doing much with it. And it's also really fun to like look back and see how I've changed in terms of art, like the kind of things I like and dislike, especially in stuff like the dragons and stuff like that. For example, looking at a lot of my dragons, I didn't really like making them very reptilian, like I almost never had like teeth outside or something like that. I almost always had them kind of more expressive and friendly, kind of How to Train Your Dragon-ish feeling. And now I've moved more towards a more kind of creaturey feel for a lot of my dragons. Like, still very friendly, I'm a very wholesome kind of art person. I don't really draw very dark stuff a lot. But yeah, I've kind of moved on definitely to have my dragons sometimes look a bit more monstery and creaturey kind of, and not just like super soft and friendly. I've also changed a lot in terms of like how I see my own art. I've grown a bit more like critical and able to see like mistakes and stuff like that. Like back when I was 11 and 12 and stuff, I remember being super proud of my art most of the times, and especially with like the art in my sketchbook and stuff, I wasn't really very good at like recognizing flaws and stuff in my own, or places where I could improve. And same thing in other people's art. I remember some stuff that I looked at when I was a kid and like, oh, that's so impressive, that's so epic, and it's so perfect, and there are no flaws and stuff, whatever. And when I look back at them now, there's a bunch of stuff in there, and like proportions are all kind of off and stuff like that. So like, yeah, I've grown a bit more, I guess, critical of my own art and other people's art, and like, but at the same time more interested in learning. So I think you can't really learn and improve much in terms of art if you can't tell where your mistakes are and where other people's mistakes are. So yeah, it's a bit of a kind of trade-off, I guess. And I think it's also kind of fun and encouraging also to think about that like 11-year-old me would have thought my art now was like really, really epic and really cool. So even though even now I constantly see like other people's art and think, oh yeah, they're so much better, and there's so much stuff I need to work on, and so many places where I still need to improve, and like there's all kinds of flaws and stuff and all kinds of places to be critical. It's also really nice looking back and thinking, oh yeah, I've come really far, and I would have like looking at old art and like my old ideas and what I thought was cool at some time in the past, like, yeah, I would really find my current art super cool when I was 11. Another fun thing I noticed while going back through my sketchbook is I was super impatient when I was younger. Like, I wouldn't really spend more than like 10 minutes on a single drawing, and you'll notice again if you look at the sketches and drawings in my sketchbook, they're really rough, and especially the ones where I colored them, you can see I didn't really want to take time to make sure I have everything colored in. I just kind of scribbled across with my colored pencils as fast as possible until it's vaguely recognizable as colored. And now I spend several days on one artwork or several hours at a time, and obviously that makes a huge difference in terms of quality and stuff like that. And speaking of spending a lot of time on an artwork before it's finished and making it look good and all, this one's done. And I'm really happy with how this version turned out. I think I managed to update it without losing the kind of important parts of the original. And I also really enjoyed how it turned out with the whole dynamic movement and perspective. It was definitely worth starting over. I originally wasn't sure whether I should even put the first try in this video, but eventually I decided it would be a nice thing to share. Not everything works out perfectly on the first try, and sometimes you just notice that something just isn't really working out. And it can be just worth taking a step back, seeing if you can still work with it, or just starting over. And in this case I started over, and it was definitely worth it. This second drawing had a way more interesting perspective and stuff like that I wouldn't have gotten if I had just stuck to the old one I was making. And that's all from me for this year. 2020 has been quite the interesting year and quite stressful, but I hope it starts getting better next year. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe as usual. I also have a Discord server, which I've linked in the description and in the pinned comment, so if you're interested in seeing some of my art early, or sharing some of your own art, feel free to join that. And with that, I wish you all a happy new year, and see you all next time.